I turn to the home team, Shelagh Whitley, who perhaps, Shelagh, you could reflect a bit on how climate finance can accelerate this transformational change that Jason is calling for.
Yes. Hi, I'm Shelagh Whitley. I'm a research fellow with ODI. Thank you all for coming today, this morning, and thank you to the panelists for participating. I'm going to try to speak quickly just a bit to ODI's work that's linked to green growth, because I think it's interesting a little bit to see what we're doing here in-house and how it touches on a lot of the topics that the panelists have raised. And we have quite a large team within ODI that's working specifically on climate finance, and specifically on this question that James raised about data around climate finance. So what lessons can you learn about money that's been spent so far, and what that tells you about what's effective in terms of achieving this transformation that's required. A lot of that word transformation is used a lot in the context of climate finance under the UNFCCC, in particular this question of $100 billion and the Green Climate Fund being directed towards transformation. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I see as one particular area where I think climate finance can be directed towards that could help to achieve transformation. So at ODI, we look particularly at this fast start finance period. We have a lot of information about what's been achieved with the 30 billion between 2010 and 2012, and we are trying to help countries, a number of developing countries, in terms of what should be done in this midterm period. And it links to what Dr. Kawai said about this question of international sources of finance to support green growth, about technology transfer, capacity building. That's a lot of what this climate finance is meant to be directed towards. And in particular, I'm looking at this question of how can this finance mobilize the private sector. So a lot of my presentation is going to focus on that. So we have this commitment under the UNFCCC, which is for $100 billion a year by 2020. What we know from a lot of other research is actually that the investment gap could be quite a lot larger than that. There's been work done now by OECD, McKinsey, the World Economic Forum about sizing this investment gap, and that is actually quite a lot more is needed than $100 billion, and that it's going to have to come from a lot of different sources. I think what's interesting about this question of rebalancing in Asia and how it links to a lot of the discourse on climate finance right now is that there's a lot of discussion in climate finance about domestic sources, public and private, regional sources, as opposed to this idea of international sources exclusively. I think also when looking at the sizing of the investment gap, in particular, the OECD has done a lot of work showing that the incremental cost may not be that high, that you do get these virtuous cycles, as James said, about through resource efficiency, the costs may not be as great as some are estimating. So I guess the question for my work in particular, and work that we're doing at ODI, is what are the tools that are used by the public sector to mobilize the private sector? And there's a whole range of tools, and again, sort of echoing what others have said here, is that these tools are not different for green growth or business as usual growth. All of these tools are currently being used now to drive economic growth, to drive development of different sectors, to promote innovation, to promote the development of different technologies. And these can be directed towards green growth, or they can continue to be directed towards brown growth or business as usual growth. And these are sort of similar instruments to the ones that were mentioned in the World Bank Inclusive Green Growth Report. They use 3 I's, but I've used sort of regulatory instruments, economic instruments, and information instruments. What I find challenging, and sort of the reason I've put this long list up there, is that when in the climate finance space or even in the green growth space, what I often find is that this discourse is really focused on just using these tools towards green. So green innovation, how can we target all of these different, new policy frameworks and de-risking tools and all the rest of it to promote renewable energy and the like. And we seem to ignore that all these tools are being used now for sort of business as usual growth, and we have very little understanding of how these incentives and subsidies are used in a kind of business as usual context. So what I wanted to try to start doing is, and I think for transformation we do really need to look at these questions more holistically. So we are not, again, it's sort of repeating what others have said about this green label, but we do end up putting ourselves in a box and focusing almost very narrowly on subsectors of energy or subsectors of agriculture or subsectors of different parts of the economy, when really what we need to do is think about the economy in a kind of holistic sense. And so as part of our work, we're trying to frame some of this, and I'm sorry it's a little bit small, but trying to look at what's going on in a national context and bring together what we know about climate finance and what we're starting to know about how these tools are being used in a kind of business as usual sense. And these are just some statistics to highlight how important it is to get an understanding in a national context of what's going on in terms of where subsidies and different tools are being used for a business as usual purpose. So what we found is we've looked at the number of developing countries for which we can find fossil fuel subsidy data, and what we find is that fossil fuel subsidies to consumers alone are 75 times the amount of climate finance that's going to these countries. And these are subsidies that are being provided domestically. So these national governments are subsidizing fossil fuels to this degree, and this is the kind of small amount of climate finance that's then being injected into these economies. And what I found so far is that most of the climate finance money is not taking into account this broader context. So a lot of the solutions that are being suggested through the use of climate finance are very targeted and are, almost in a way, Band-Aid solutions where you're trying to put in place, let's say, an energy efficiency program or subsidy loan in an economy where the energy prices are extremely low because of domestic subsidies. And there doesn't seem to be a connection between these two, kind of the national context and these climate finance interventions. So I just want to quickly, and there was a question about recommendations that can be made under the UNFCCC. And I guess in the context of climate finance and this question of transformation, the question is, what can we do to make sure that this climate finance spend is being spent with a very clear understanding of the national context within countries, and that there's national level diagnostics that are being done to look at the readiness for climate investment, that they include this consideration of subsidies. I guess also just speaking to the last question of inclusive green growth, we also know that some of the early work that's been done on subsidy reform has been linked to social protection. So you have the opportunity through subsidy reform, not just fossil fuel subsidies, but broader subsidy reform, to generate domestic resources that can both be used for innovation and climate finance, but then also not only, once you get energy prices rising because you have subsidy reform, you can also use those resources potentially for social protection, and that's being started to be done in India and other countries. So I just thought it's a bit of more of a micro approach, but just to give you a sense of the work that we're doing and how we're trying to make a link between the kind of climate finance opportunities and this question of transformation that's required.
Shelagh, thank you very much.